So first of all, thank you, Pat, for that. And not only thank you for that, but thank you to you and the other researchers on the Boundary Breaking Project, who I think have done such an amazing job in really widening our thinking and deepening our thinking around this whole area of abuse so that it doesn't just present itself as a difficult problem or even a terrible tragedy in the life of the church, but it actually strangely becomes a moment of realization, self-honesty, and out of that a kind of a hope. I'm not going to say a huge amount. I'm not going to speak as long as Pat, and maybe open up a conversation between Pat and myself with what I am going to say, but I'm going to respond really from my own perspective as somebody coming to this work after the Boundary Breaking Project and after the reports of both the Cross of the Moment and the quantitative report that has been published. And in doing this, I'm using, sorry, that was a mistake. I'm using some images. We've seen some lovely quotes, and I'll be using quotes as well from the people who we heard from in the boundary breaking research. But I've also from a parallel project in Spain. I think there's always been a difficult question about how we use the stories of survivors. And I think there was a very wise decision made by the authors of the Cross of the Moment not to rehearse the stories, to use quotes that were insightful and helpful and opened up windows into experience, but not to tell stories. In this project in the Diocese of Madrid, the Proyecto Repara, they've actually worked with workshops with survivors to develop artistic and craft ways of expressing something of their reality as survivors of abuse. And I'm using those images throughout these slides with permission, though if we do circulate these slides, please don't use them yourselves, don't hand them on without permission from the original source, and the website for that is here. So really what I want to talk about is really just responses to what we've heard from Pat and to the boundary breaking research in general, as somebody who's thinking about the ways in which we need to take the next step after this amazing work. And I want to start with what my reaction was to first reading The Cross of the Moment. And I did it relatively quickly. For those of you who read it or tried to read it or read a bit of it, it is a long document. And it sort of takes its toll on you as well. You know, if you take it seriously and enter into it, I think there are moments which are really you have to kind of stop and think quite deeply before moving on. And again, it wasn't just at the end. Again and again, I found myself asking this question. How did an organization that was founded in and for the command to love one another forget so radically, get so badly wrong what it means to love well? And that for me was the great scandal again and again, whether it was about the occasions of abuse themselves, but perhaps even more so the mishandling and the bystandership and all the other things that are raised by that report. And a sort of, not a despairing, but a growing sense of like, how on earth did we get here? And we were called out, let's be clear, really, we were called out by society, not by our own mechanisms within the church. And so a question that arises, where do I go with this? How can I move on from this in any way that is hopeful and life-giving? And for me, the key was to return to this question that Pat started us off with. What meaning can we find in this experience? And I think it's something that initially I felt almost slightly uncomfortable about, that we should be finding meaning in these terrible wounds and in these experiences of so many people, of course, that haven't disclosed and are still just living silently with these wounds and difficulties. And part of this actually then led me to a point where actually what we need to do is to begin to discern what a response is, because it's clear from the report itself that all that's been heard from survivors, from bishops, from parishioners, from parish priests, all that's been heard can be a moment at which we actually say, what is God trying to tell us? And I was very struck by this coming not just from the writers of the report, who have a section which talks about, you know, the clerical abuse as a catalyst for change in the church, but also from different voices among the participants themselves. And these are just a few of them. I won't read them verbatim. They're there for you to see. But this sense, whether from the bishop who's quoted here, what is God teaching us? The priest who sort of says, this is a really horrible situation, but you know what? This, in 100 years' time, we'll look back on this and say this was really important, what we did here. And a woman too, who sort of somewhat hesitantly finds her way to sort of saying, this is really difficult and everything, but you know what? It was necessary because we would never have been able to change in the ways that we needed to change. And all this suggests to me that the cross of the moment and the research that lies behind it is calling the whole of the church community, not just safeguarding officers, not just survivor-led groups, not just priests, not just bishops, but the whole of the church, to increasingly deepen our communal discernment of what the meaning of these stories, these experiences, these great wounds in church life are. Again, not just the abuse, but the mishandling of the abuse. And indeed, around the whole area of the sexual abuse, there is increasingly an awareness, I think, of spiritual abuse, pastoral abuse, emotional and psychological abuse that can go alongside that, but is very much part of the same picture. And I think that's being more and more recognized. This has led me and others, and I think this was very much what Pat was saying in several points in what she was presenting to us, that what we really need to do is to look through the lens of safeguarding and the abuse crisis to beyond safeguarding and beyond the crisis itself and the tragedies there. That what's required is a conversation that takes us into a future which doesn't forget the past, which doesn't forget these past experiences. And of course, let's forget, these are not things that are just done and dusted and they don't happen anymore. The chances are they are still happening because it's a thing that happens in human organizations. And we also know that, of course, for survivors, this never goes away. It's never sorted out. So it's not that we leave our past behind, but what is the way that we can move into the future? The Pontifical Commission for the Protection of Minors, Tutelum Minorum, published for the first time an annual report this year, and it talked about how it saw church communities as having two moments in relation to safeguarding. The first of which is the recognition of the problem and the putting in place of real safeguarding strategies and policies, auditing, regulatory bodies, clear sets of process and accountability. And the second transition, and in many ways, I think we could look at the church in England, Wales, and in Scotland, and sort of say, okay, so partly through the ICSA report and all the related reports around it, we have made quite a lot of progress in that regard. But as the Justin Welby thing, I think, speaks vividly to us of now, that is not enough. So the second transition that Tutelum Minorum talks about here is that there should be a long-term process, a forward-looking process of properly addressing the aftermath of widespread abuse and the mishandling of cases, the aftermath, caring for victims and survivors, and addressing the impacts on the entire church. I think the cross of the moment calls us into that second transition and does more, because I think it's not just saying that we need to address the impacts of something that's happened in the past, but it's saying we need to learn from that so as to actually become a different kind of a culture, a different kind of a church, so as to, if not entirely prevent these things happening, to actually learn from them in a way that we can actually be a better church, not only in relation to clerical sexual abuse or church leader sexual abuse, but actually to all kinds of abuse and harm and failures to love properly. That question, how do we get to be so bad at loving? How do we get to learn to be better at it through this experience and through this lens? I've used the language of conversation a lot here, and it's key to the project that's following on from the boundary breaking project that I'm leading on. And I think it's worth to start thinking about this. And I was aware that Pat was inviting us into a conversation in our time together in this webinar, and indeed in the subsequent webinar as well, because it's by conversations, it's by sharing openly and honestly. Truth telling is talked a lot about in the report, that we're actually going to be able to bring about change. Sometimes I think we think, oh, you know, it has to be more than talking. Actions arise, good actions arise out of good conversations. And I'm very indebted here to, again, a kind of secular source around systems change and culture change within human organization. And the idea that conversations are an everyday art form by which we make ourselves together. We need to change our conversations. We need to widen them and deepen them around the themes that Pat has presented to us and has so beautifully set out and discussed and illustrated for us in The Cross of the Moment. And I think it's no coincidence that this human wisdom about change has its deep echoes with the Ignatian and synodal practices that Pope Francis is calling the church into. These are commonly talked about in terms of listening in and for the Spirit, but they have practices related to them. A practice is not just of spiritual listening in a kind of constrained form, but practices of cultural conversation, which is about, you know, that term parrhesia, speaking the truth with courage and openness, not being ashamed to speak it, being able to tell truth, so as to, even when we have different understandings of what that truth is, sometimes being able to tell the truth, being able to share that with transparency and honesty, and knowing that we're going to be safe when we do it, that I can say what I think is true, and I'm not going to be jumped on, I'm not going to be judged, I'm not going to be somehow marginalized in that conversation. And that image of synodal practice that I think gets overlooked very often, it's in the preparatory document of the crowd, that Jesus is surrounded by the crowd and there is nobody in the crowd with whom he will not speak. He is open to the conversations that arise out of the crowd. And I think that's where we need to increasingly situate ourselves as, well, as safeguarding practitioners, as pastors, but actually just as ordinary baptized people. That's where we should be doing this stuff. Pat talked about the importance of restorative justice, and I've learned a lot actually from Pat and from the report, and been helped to understand more and more what that kind of might look like in terms of the sort of healing circles and the restoration of proper relationship between people that's needed. But in the light of that, I was struck particularly by the introduction of what I think is quite new language, again in the Tutela Minorum report, which is about conversional justice. That justice, the kind of justice that restores in the wake of this revelation of wound and brokenness, is a justice that requires conversion. And that's not a simple thing. You of course need good structures, you need good policies, but in itself, it isn't going to actually bring about the interior conversion, not only of individuals, but of a culture, of a parish culture, the way we speak to each other, the way we worship together, the way we hold meetings together or not, the way we just welcome each other, or the language we use, is a way in which we can convert a church that seems somewhere along the way as a culture to have forgotten what it is to love properly. Not in individuals. Of course, there's always been proper love in the church, but there's been some serious failings culturally in that as well. And trying to understand what it might be to repair that, to restore that, I think requires this sense of searching for a conversional justice, which will actually lead to a conversional culture, which helps us actually change the way we think, change the way we see things through this painful lens of the abuse scandals. And so the question I would then end with is, so how each of us singly and together to work to enable this conversion of ourselves, first of all, but conversions of each other, those we work with, of others in the church, but also of wider society. I think the church has got a gift, potentially, despite our great failings, to give wider society in this regard. And this is, this final slide is just sort of to head up that this is moving forward. These sorts of ideas are moving forward into this next project of conversations, culture and communion, that the details of which are there. But I will stop sharing at that point. And Pat, I don't know whether you have anything that you want to kind of respond to, anything I've said there before we open up for wider questions, or...
Okay, so Claire and I agreed that we would perhaps just chat for about 5 minutes after we'd both presented so that we could stop continue this as a conversation, really. That's it's as simple as that. We're used to having conversations, and it's how the research proceeded.
Mm.
Um, and it's what we're inviting people to do with the report. Well, I suppose what I'm going to do, Claire, is I'm going to take off the hat of being either a writer or researcher. I'm going to put on the hat of being a member of a parish.
Mm.
And I'm going to kind of challenge us because I think I'm just trying to imagine in my parish what it looks like to do this.
Mm.
And well, maybe I'm wearing two hats because you can't quite take hats off like that. It's not that easy.
Not
But
hats, really.
yeah, because I was kind of thinking, what are the spaces? I mean, my parish, like I'm sure lots of yours, it's just four parishes that just became one parish. So we've got four churches. We've got one priest here and one priest absent, who might come back, we hope. So we've got a very overworked parish priest and all sorts of things that happen, but it's really hard to find the kind of space in
Mm.
which this kind of conversation might happen. Still less to even get to have a conversation with the parish priest because he's so busy all the time, and he's busy in a good way. That's not in any way a criticism. We need to understand that. And I've thought about this a lot since finishing the research because I really think it matters to work out how this plays at the ground level.
Mm. Mm.
Um, and, and that's why I think the role of parish safeguarding reps is so important. I mean, I've said to the group in our four churches that I would love to just do a bit of reading with them, to read some bits of the report and talk with them. And a couple have said that they would like to do it. I also decided that I had to kind of put my money where my mouth is kind of thing. So I wrote to my bishop and said, I think we should have a reading group and I think it would be good for you to be in it. Because I do. I think
Mm.
I think the main thing is to not listen to lectures, but to have some conversations and read it. And for people like bishops and priests and others in leadership roles, because we very carefully use the phrase office holders, they're a very varied group, to sit down with other people and listen. So I suppose the impact for me of the research, quite personally, was I needed I needed to take responsibility to speak out. And but I still live in that challenge of what are the right spaces? Because I kind of think, should we have this thing called parish mission group, which is a bit like a parish council. They have longer meetings than anyone in the parish because they have so much
Yeah.
admin and facilities work and all sorts of things to sort out. Are they the place to start? So I just want to acknowledge that brass tacks wise, it's really
Mm.
difficult to know how you actually do this at parish level. And
Mm.
I wondered if you had what your thoughts are about that before we open it up.
I mean, I think you're absolutely right. And a couple of things I would say. One is that I'm fairly sure that trying to go in from a kind of structural point of view, 9 times out of 10 won't work. So I think you're right about the parish council, mission council, whatever they call themselves, that actually that's not the way to get these conversations going. I think that the idea of actually whether it's the safeguarding representatives or actually sort of saying, are there a few people who actually just are interested in doing it in this way, is one of the ways that then the conversation can begin to become part of the culture. And I think what I'm finding in working with the different groups I'm working with at the moment in the last 3 months is that in each group you need to find, and it's only the group, and each parish is different, it's only the particular parish or the particular group that's going to know the right way in for them into how this can happen. And it has to kind of emerge inductively. Now, on one level, that's me kind of getting myself off the hook because I'm saying like, well, there is no one size fits all. There is no answer to the question you're asking because it has to be discerned as we go along. And you try things and they fail as well. But I do think one thing that's absolutely key in what you said, and you didn't say whether your bishop had responded or not, and perhaps that's not fair to ask you, but I do think there's something about having conversations across what are often perceived to be bounded social realities within the church. Now, the obvious one is clergy, laity, but it's not the only one. There's also the active members of the parish. We all know, and I've been there, the active people in the parish and the kind of the ordinary people who rock, or the people who only turn up at Christmas and Easter, somehow that makes them lesser. So actually to find ways in which And I think the place to start is trying to tackle the kind of clergy laity divide. It's very obvious in the synodal process that it's parish priests' voice that have not been heard, weirdly, in that process. And I think that's a really key thing. Now, how that is done, I do think there's something about the relationship between the parish safeguarding representative and the parish priest that we need to look at, because that's not, I think it's better than it was, but I think that's often not as great as it could be, and not understood by either party very often as a kind of discerning conversational culture change relationship. It tends to be a little bit more transactional and regulatory. And again, that might be something that safeguard dioceses and safeguarding officers can work with, or that as people like yourself, you know, who can sort of say, well, let's look at this together and see what we can do. But I think it just has to come from inside that group. And the problem is who are the facilitators to make that happen. So two parishes been suggested to me in this work to run as pilots for this kind of conversation, and I can go in and see what happens, and it may not work, but that's two parishes. And so how do you make sure that this is something that can be, and maybe that's just a way of increasing our safeguarding responsibilities.